think it's really cool that we're still considered relevant.
Never before has there been a rock band quite like Metallica.
There is unlikely ever to be a metal band as big or as grandiose in its ambitions and its songwriting scope as Metallica. And the reason for that really is that they have an expert songwriting grasp, right? And then they combine that with amazing performances and huge productions and a very sort of attractive kind of aesthetic that pulls people in. It's a sort of tribally attractive home really for lots of people. That's Metallica.
In the music world, you get very used to controlling your own environment. We have like an inbuilt fear of stagnation or repetition or kind of irrelevance, I guess.
The Californian quartet has sold more than 100 million albums worldwide, won 9 Grammy Awards, and had 5 consecutive albums hit #1 on the Billboard charts.
And the exciting thing about Metallica is they're not finished, and they'll never finish. There'll always be another mountain to climb.
But Metallica's story, epic in scope, is a tale about much more than sales figures and critical acclaim. Their journey from scuzzy Los Angeles garages to the world's biggest stadiums has been dramatic and painful, with their amazing success often shot through with tensions, tragedy, loss, and controversy.
They don't just represent the highs, but also the lows, the triumphs, the tragedies, the victories. When Metallica succeeds, everybody wants to share in the glory. Metallica are undeniably just one of the greatest bands of all time.
This is the definitive story of one of the most significant rock bands of all time.
One of the first things I ever noticed the first time I interviewed all of Metallica was just how personable they were. I mean, by that point, Saint Anger had come out. They'd sold over 100 million records. And yet I couldn't shake the sense that they were just a bunch of slightly goofy guys who were still excited to be sitting down to be giving interviews, but also excited to be doing what they were doing. You know, you can form a really strange impression of them because they can seem so distant and kind of bathed, in this incredible material wealth and privilege. But the truth is, they're still a bunch of kind of goofy metalheads.
How's it feel that the fans like us?
Well, not bad. Not bad.
I got a headache.
That the fans...
I love the fans.
Selected the sign.
Oh, is that the question?
Absolutely great.
Excuse me, guys.
You know, they're both valid. They're people, either your peers or your fans, they respect you somehow, so they vote for you. Either way, it's still an award thing that either show up and enjoy. I like coming and playing the things. I mean, coming to accept an award is kind of weird. Coming and playing is more the fun bit.
You guys and the after party.
In the 80s, when big hair and small ideas dominated the heavy metal scene in the States, Metallica's blend of brains and brawn gave the genre a much-needed charge.
The LA metal scene in the early 80s was very much glam-oriented. In fact, it became much more glam-oriented. And when people talk about the big hair scene in the 1980s, really the home was LA. And Metallica didn't belong. They weren't a glam band, they weren't a big hair band, they weren't a melodic hard rock band, and those are the sort of bands you had to be if you're going to get noticed in LA. They were much more an underground extreme metal band.
At the time of Metallica's formation, there wasn't a thrash metal scene as such. What really influenced Metallica to go in the direction that they went, as well as Venom, were Motorhead. There was this whole influence of English bands in America who made almost more of an impact over there than they did in the UK. That's the crazy thing. So it's kind of odd to think about how this English influence sort of infused on all these Californian sort of future thrash metal bands. The term was coined probably, we think, in about 83, 84. Thrash, the word, had been used to talk about skate punk bands, funny enough. There had been various compilations which had the word thrash in. That was applied to this sort of new, faster kind of heavy metal, which Metallica really were the first to take to the mainstream. So it was all very pioneering what they were doing, There wasn't anything really like them before they got started, and once they had started, then the virus spread really fast.
As their career progressed on, the band's lyrics tackled war, censorship, and other political issues that the genre didn't typically address. The group sharpened their focus as songwriters with singles like the horror movie stomper Enter Sandman becoming huge rock anthems. Fans responded in droves, buying 6 million copies of the group's 5th full-length album, the self-titled Metallica, and elevating their previous LPs to platinum status. In the process, the grim-faced frontman James Hetfield became not only a hero for the nation's largest fraternity of misfits, but also a critically respected songwriter and band leader.
James Hetfield is possibly the best frontman there is. He's the archetypal thrash metal frontman, the way he presents himself, the way he sings, the way he performs, the way he talks to the audience.
And what's interesting is that he is not really like many of his predecessors. Nowadays, of course, because he's post-therapy and post-rehab, he has a great line in bringing a crowd together, talking about how we're all a metal family, all that good stuff, which really does work, and it makes a big crowd sort of think as one.
He's become an accomplished frontman. You can't compare him to a Freddie Mercury or a Robert Plant or a David Lee Roth or any of those people, because he's also playing guitar. But in terms of his character, it's very much a larger-than-life character in his own right. And he really projects well. He knows how to deal with an audience. He understands how to talk to 100,000 people and make each one feel like they're in a club with 100 people, and to talk to a club of 100 people and make it seem like a stadium. So he's very impressive.
But in the early days, specifically in the 80s, he was much more abrasive. He was a drinker back then, so that used to make him a little bit more, I don't know, profane in his on-stage announcements, and a little bit more prone to whipping up the crowd, especially in small clubs. But along the way, it's interesting because it's been a process of gaining confidence for Hatfield. He started out as this sort of shy guy, didn't even speak to the crowd in the first few gigs they did because he just didn't have the courage to face them. Obviously that passed. Obviously he grew into his art and he became a supreme frontman.
For the first time in the band's history, Metallica headlined the legendary festival Glastonbury in 2014, with Lars Ulrich stating, "We have one shot. You never know if you'll be invited back."
They're still first to do. It's awesome.
Metallica at Glastonbury got very controversial before they did it, with a lot of people saying, "Why are Metallica doing it? How dare they? James Hetfield hunts bears. Who does he think he is?" And there was so much antipathy and animosity, and the general opinion beforehand was Metallica will get booed. They're going to die. What happened? They went down a storm.
Metallica did a great job at Glastonbury. The crowd liked them. They played a very sort of sedate set of hits to keep the crowd happy. If it had been me, and I'd been Lars planning the set list, I would have put a few sort of more extreme songs in there. I would love to have seen Dies Eve, I'd love to have seen Disposable Heroes, but I guess they reckon they wouldn't go down too well with the festival crowd.
The festival circuit in Europe is so amazing. One of the things is in the States we don't really have a whole lot like this. There's a couple things that we do have, but it always seems like after a couple years they kind of die out and fade out. But we feel that there's just so much enthusiasm here that something like this could work well, you know, associated with what we do and how we do it. And it's a lot of fun at the end of the day, and that's what it boils down to. So it's been a good summer for us.
If you watch the footage, they got a tremendous response, possibly better than even they expected. And so, but they took the place by storm and did a lot of good for metal in terms of proving to people who probably were there who hate metal that actually, you know what, there's some good in metal. Maybe you should open your ears and eyes a little bit. So from all points of view, it was a triumph.
Every time I see Metallica, I never fail to be completely electrified. You know, just the moment the Ecstasy of Gold comes on, you kind of feel like something special is going to happen. There's just something so powerful. There's so much gravitas. And it just sweeps over the entire room. I mean, it's the closest that a metal gig comes to a spiritual experience for a lot of people, including myself. And it's always been that way from the very beginning up until just seeing him this year. It's always been that moment that James Hetfield comes out on stage. He's not a front man, he's like a general commanding a legion.
Metallica's tale is as inspiring as it is triumphant. To understand the unique journey that the four rockers went through, we have to go back to the beginning to where it all started. James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich came from different worlds to form Metallica in the LA suburbs in 1981. Hatfield was born on August 3, 1963 in Downey, California. His father owned a trucking company and his mother was a light opera singer. He was raised in a strict Christian Science home. Lars Ulrich, the other founding member of Metallica, was born on December 26, 1963 in Gentofte, Denmark. In February 1973, Lars's father managed to get 5 tickets to a Deep Purple concert. The young Ulrich found himself mesmerized by the performance. The concert had a considerable impact on Lars, inspiring his entrance into the world of rock and roll and later heavy metal. As a result of his newfound interest in music, he received his first drum kit from his grandmother at the age of 12. Lars's love for heavy metal resulted in him moving to the States in 1980. Lars and James first met in Los Angeles in late 1981. When Lars Ulrich placed an advertisement in a local paper, looking for other rock musicians to jam with.
Basically, he said, I want to form a band. Any like-minded individuals out there, these are the bands I'm into. And he met James Hetfield through that particular medium. And they started to jam together, started to rehearse together. Initially, James had thought Lars is rubbish. He can't even put his drum kit together. But then they started to realise actually each got something the other one can play off of.
There were various meetings where, not so successful meetings, where they rehearsed, it didn't go too well. They only really got together as a band when a guy called Brian Slagle, who looks after the Metal Blade label, offered them a track on a compilation he was putting out called Metal Massacre.
Before they even had a band together, Lars had agreed we'll put a track on the compilation.
And they recorded the song Hit the Lights for that one. And once that had happened, they were sort of off and running.
And as a result of that, it almost put pressure on the band, on Lars and James. We'd better get a band together, a proper band, and go out and do this to some extent properly if we can.
After brainstorming a number of potential names for the band, one was eventually chosen. And in October 1981, Metallica was born. Adding guitarist Dave Mustaine and bassist Ron McGovney, the band started writing songs and recording demo tapes. Metallica's lineup solidified after Cliff Burton replaced McGovney in 1982.
So the original bass player was a guy called Ron McGovney, whose garage they used to play in. Perfectly nice guy, I've interviewed him a couple of times, perfectly decent bass player, but not really a sort of a whirlwind bass player, which is what they were looking for. And they found that in Cliff Burton, who was playing in a band called Trauma at the time. He lived near San Francisco, and when Lars and James approached Cliff to join Metallica, he said he would, only on condition that the band moved up to San Francisco.
And San Francisco, because especially the Bay Area, became known as the home of thrash. Because Metallica, Testament, Exodus, so many bands came out of that area who belonged to the thrash scene. So it suited Metallica and what they were going to do. Philosophically, it was where they needed to be. And musically, it gave them the chance to really develop without the pressure of trying to conform to being a more glam-oriented style of band, and therefore becoming more successful in LA. So then moving into San Francisco allowed them to develop and also allowed the San Francisco scene to develop.
After the band had settled in San Francisco, Bay Area guitarist Kirk Hammett replaced Dave Mustaine. Mustaine, who was booted out for excessive substance abuse, went on to form the band Megadeth.
He had problems with alcohol and drugs, as he's often talked about, not least in his autobiography from a few years ago. And in the early days, he could be a bit of a handful. I mean, he was a bit of a father figure or big brother figure in some ways to the other guys in Metallica. But the flip side of his personality was that he was a little bit of an angry drunk, you know, one of those guys you don't necessarily want around. And this is all by his own admission. We all know people like this. It's, you know, it's not unusual. When the time came in early '83, when Metallica were on their way working towards the recording sessions for the first album, they decided to let him go. And by all accounts, it was fairly brutal the way they did it. He himself asked for a second chance, you know, and he wasn't given one. They woke him up one morning and they put him on a Greyhound bus back to California.
Since Creed is patching everything up, are you going to patch things up with Dave Mustaine?
Did a long time ago. It's old news.
After gaining a solid cult following among fans who couldn't identify with contemporary pretty boy pop metal combos such as Van Halen and Bon Jovi, Metallica became known for their sophisticated, often complex song structures and serious lyrics that reflected teen obsessions with anger, despair, fear, and death. In sharp contrast to those other death-obsessed metal bands, Metallica's lyrics posed deeper questions about justice and retribution, drug addiction, mental illness, and political violence. The group's debut album, Kill 'Em All, is an anarchic catharsis of gloom with songs like No Remorse, decrying the insanity of war, and Seek and Destroy, looking for mindless violence.
Kill 'Em All really was the birth of thrash. 1983, it was going to be called Metal Up Your Ass, and was supposed to have a cover with a hand holding a machete coming out of a toilet bowl. Unfortunately, the label they were signed to in America, Megaforce, felt that it wouldn't get distributed in shops because a lot of the retail chains would look at the cover and say, we're not stocking that. So they decided to say, okay, we'll call it Kill 'Em All and have a cover which has got a pool of blood and a sledgehammer. Yeah, that's much more sort of comforting, isn't it?
Kill 'Em All was one of the legendary albums, no matter what kind of music you're into, you know. From that very abrasive cover art to its title to the music within it. It's not produced in a particularly sophisticated manner.
But the album itself really captured what Metallica had been about on their demos. Anyone who had the No Life to Leather demo, and that's something important to remember, is that Metallica, who years later were anti-Napster, actually in their early days encouraged tape trading. So they put their demo tapes into the tape trading market, and kids all over the world would get hold of a tape, copy it 10, 20 times and give it to their mates. That's how they got their reputation and name known.
As for the music, I mean, it's you know, you ask Hatfield, he'll tell you it's pure Bay Area 1982 metal. There's a couple of super fast songs, Whiplash, and the end part of No Remorse, which is incredibly sort of rapid picking. You've got all that amazing soloing from Kirk Hammett, who had an awful lot to prove because he just joined the band in the wake of Dave Mustaine being kicked out. And lots of sort of melodic stuff. You can tell really that their influences came from melodic bands. You know, Hatfield was a major Aerosmith fan.
Now you listen to Kill 'Em All and it doesn't sound extreme at all. It sounds much more like a mainstream metal band. But at the time it was really way out there and really on the cutting edge of where metal was going, and it excited a lot of people. It was the first time people outside of America really had the opportunity to get involved and invest in Metallica unless they had copies of the demos through the tape trading scene. So it really opened up everything for them.
And it had a European feel, which I think American audiences liked. So when it came out, it didn't sell in vast quantities, you know. It established the band for as what they were, you know, a sort of serious force in the making. But it's funny how you listen back nowadays and it's so raw.
It sold well enough to capture the imagination of people and to make people realise here was something a little different in metal, and here was a band who were leading something a little different in metal and leading the natural successor to the new wave of British heavy metal. So Metallica became really the logical beast to follow Iron Maiden, to follow Motorhead, to follow Diamond Head, all the bands that inspired them in the first place.
Metallica recorded their second album, Ride the Lightning, at Sweet Silence Studios in Copenhagen, Denmark. The album was released in August 1984 and peaked at 100 on the Billboard 200 chart.
I think Ride the Lightning was the first recording Metallica did that truly displayed the compositional genius of Cliff Burton.
And you can sense the maturity when you listen to Ride the Lightning. It's amazing, you know, they wrote the stuff and recorded it when they were in their early 20s. But it sounds incredibly developed and evolved. Compare it to Kill 'Em All and they're like night and day. It kind of has this sort of soft, billowy, sort of faraway feel. It doesn't have the grit and the sharp edge that Kill 'Em All had. But that suits the song because they go in both directions. I mean, they're much faster, some of them. Fight Fire with Fire is the fastest song they ever recorded. It epitomises thrash. I've met death metal musicians who regard that as a kind of a proto-death metal song. And then you get these sort of softer, stadium-sized songs like For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is just this simple 3 or 4 chord thing that you just punch the air to. And it was designed almost for giant stadiums full of people to react to.
And they also had developed the style of the music. There were bigger epics on the album as well as shorter songs. So for the first time, we heard what Metallica could really do. It wasn't just about oh, let's hit them really hard, getting those heads banging, bang those heads that will not bang, one of those famous Metallica lines from Whiplash song. What they also did was show they had musicianship and they had ambition to really bring the musicianship out to the fore. And they were still learning their craft and still feeling their way forward. But in doing so, they were also pushing the boundaries.
So it was such a step forward, it still blows my mind. I mean, you know, you've got to remember, it came out within a year or so, or a year and a half or so, of Kill 'Em All. And to make that leap in that short a time still blows my mind to this day.
You know, it's been said before, I think best, by a guy called Brand Daler. He's the drummer of Mastodon. He once summed it up so brilliantly to me. He was like, the thing is everyone thinks about just how heavy Metallica are. The truth is, they combined light and shade. They were like poets or artists. They had the heavy, but they also had the beautiful, and Ride the Lightning was the first hint that they comprehended that balance. That was completely down to Cliff Burton and his comprehension of music, not just of metal, but music.
And by that point, Ride the Lightning, they'd pretty much gone away from the thrash scene almost completely, even though they were very much a die-hard, hardcore thrash band. And it was very successful. It got noticed in America a lot more than Kill 'Em All, and it certainly gave them a much bigger fan base in the UK.
Metallica revisited Sweet Silence Studios in Denmark to record their third studio album, Master of Puppets. The album is considered by many to be Metallica's greatest work. It peaked at number 29 on the Billboard 200 and spent 72 weeks on the chart. Following the release of the album, the band supported Ozzy Osbourne for a tour around the United States. By now, Metallica's music had moved away from the thrash sound that had made Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning so popular.
It's still very loud, it's still very heavy, and it's still very fast. But by now, you wouldn't have called Metallica a thrash band, you would have called them a heavy metal band. At the heavier end of the spectrum, because all of the rough edges that come with the thrash metal thing have pretty much been polished off, and what remains is a real juggernaut of a powerful heavy metal band who are reaching the pinnacle of, you know. And if you think about it, it's only their third album. They hadn't really been going a huge amount of time. The development of Metallica between Kill 'Em All and Master of Puppets is phenomenal, with Ride the Lightning as that sort of middle step in between.
There are so many people who basically say that once Master of Puppets was done, they should have split up. That was it. They never got beyond that. Never, ever really did anything again that reached the heights that they reached on Master of Puppets.
To my mind, and this might sound a bit biased, you cannot be a music fan. I'm not talking about metal fans. You can't be a fan of music, full stop, and not own Master of Puppets. It is absolutely as important as Led Zeppelin 1. It is absolutely important as Dark Side of the Moon. It is the absolute codification of what heavy metal is. Every color of the palette is in that album. Listen to Battery. If your pulse doesn't quicken, you're dead.
It's my favourite Metallica album. I know a lot of people out there would say it's theirs. You got tracks like Master of Puppets, Damage Incorporated, Battery. There are so many great tracks on that album that really, you listen to the whole thing from beginning to end, and it's just a remarkable experience even now.
When you look back, with hindsight, you can see that there was this progression from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning to Master of Puppets. The band just went up and up and up. And they split off and went in different directions after this. But Puppets remains their sort of definitive statement. I think even they acknowledge this.
It was a sensational record, and it took them to a new level. It took them almost out of metal, and it laid the seeds, I think, for what they were to do with the Black Album a few years later. Even though it's not as commercial as the Black Album, there are elements in there. They're very competent in doing the epics, very powerful in doing the shorter songs. The structure of the songs is more sophisticated. The whole thing reeked of a band who were comfortable in their own skin, but their skin was actually growing. And of course, it was a huge success. And it was the first Metallica album to really sell big time in America. It suddenly showed that people were taking notice of this band, and they weren't just a piddling little underground thrash metal band who was sold to about 500 people. They were selling to 500,000 people.
It's because of the quality of the songwriting, the sort of imagination that goes into the performances. There were some pretty clever production tricks that went into it. And what you've got, when you add all that up, when all the stars align, you have something that's the near perfect metal album. Some people would say it's completely perfect.
Metallica were now a force to be reckoned with. They were selling out shows all over the globe and wowing fans with their electric live performances. However, the band members were soon to go through a traumatic event that would leave the future of Metallica in doubt. In late 1986, Metallica was struck by tragedy. During their European tour, Metallica's tour bus skidded off an icy road in Sweden, killing bassist Cliff Burton.
The death of Cliff Burton was a total shock. Nobody saw it coming. How could we? He wasn't exactly a big druggie, wasn't exactly drinking himself to death. And Cliff, unfortunately, was sleeping in a bunk which did not have a protected window and went through it, and the bus fell on top of him. So it must have been a horrendous moment. And the scenes there were apparently total chaos. No one quite knew what was going on. And then they realised that Cliff was under the bus, and apparently at the time he was still alive. So a crane was brought to winch the bus up, but then lost control of the bus and couldn't keep the bus's weight. So it crashed back onto him. And the state of shock the band were in was almost unbelievable. You can't even begin to imagine what they must have been going through in their minds.
Much has been written about Cliff Burton. He wasn't just, the basis for, Metallica's brilliance, in songwriting. Above all else, he was also their incredible friend. Through the years, they've given so many interviews about him. And one thing that connects all of their reflections on who he was and what he meant to them suggests that he almost had like a paternal relationship with them. He was always the guy who was out of step with the times, who really didn't care. He was the one that they looked up to, not just as musicians, but also as bandmates.
So he was kind of this sort of guru figure, in a way, that everybody in Metallica looked up to. And therefore, his tragic death was an immense loss. And it's a loss I think you could possibly say that the band has still to this day have never really recovered from.
There was this legend going around for some years about how it was that Cliff came to occupy the bunk next to the window of the bus. It had been said that the band had pulled cards from a pack to determine who got the uncomfortable one, right? And that Cliff had pulled the ace of spades, or words to that effect. And I never believed this. And a few years ago I was writing a book about Cliff, and I interviewed Kirk Hammett for it. And I asked him if this was true, and he said it's completely true. That's exactly what they did. It sounds like one of those sort of sell your soul at the crossroads sort of myths, but it's actually what happened. And it had tragic consequences.
The state of shock in the metal world was incredible, and Cliff's importance to the band was such that a lot of people felt they couldn't carry on without him. They did, and fair play to them for doing that. Whether they had decided to do it or not to do it, that was always their call and no one else's, and no one should stand in judgment on them for doing that at all.
And I think that once he was gone, it wasn't just tragic for the band, it was a loss for all fans of music. Cliff Burton was a true visionary. He was a man who brought a kind of elegance and just beauty to music that has never been duplicated. I think Metallica knew that, and I can't imagine how you would cope with the loss of that magnitude. They did through their music. They hit the road straight away. They went back to writing straight away. That's no way to do it, but I think that's the only way that they knew how, and I guess they had to do something. I can't even begin to guess at the pain that they felt at that time, but it does come across in so much of their music.
The major impact, in hindsight, of Cliff dying so young and at this pivotal point in the band's career is really that it transferred control of Metallica to Lars and James, who have been the band's stewards ever since. Cliff wasn't a dominating kind of character, but when he was in the band, he was a little bit older. He was certainly more musically literate than the rest of the band. He taught them an awful lot about harmony and so on. And nothing really got done in Metallica without his say-so. He was a decision maker in lots of ways. But so when he died and he wasn't there anymore, the path was clear for Lars and James to take over.
With Jason Newsted selected to replace the somewhat irreplaceable Cliff Burton, the band wasted no time in hitting the studio to record their fourth studio album, And Justice for All. Metallica were criticized for recording the new album so soon after Cliff's death, but it was a way for them to deal with the tragic passing of their great friend.
And Justice for All is an incredibly interesting record. I've always looked at it as more of a transitional record, where Metallica were going rather than where they actually arrived at with the Black Album. Certainly, it's interesting because they were going progressive. It was obvious that their aspirations as musicians was perhaps superseding their desire to just sound really heavy or just sort of display what they're capable of up on stage.
And Justice for All is a great album, but it's very different to Master of Puppets. It's less aggressive, it's more cleanly produced. It exposed Metallica to a slightly more commercial audience, so they were nominated for a Grammy for the first time, for example.
Despite the album's success, internal problems between the band members were starting to become an issue. Jason Newsted's musical ideas for the album were ignored by the other members, and he only received writing credit for one song on the album.
The impact on the band was such that Jason Newsted, whom they chose to succeed Cliff, always felt he was never accepted as a full-time member of the band, even though he was there for well over 15 years, even though he was there during the biggest commercial successes Metallica ever had. He always felt he was never accepted, especially by James.
With this album came the band's first music video for the single One.
Metallica always said that they would never do a video unless they did it on their own terms. They tried to do a video during the Master of Puppets era, didn't feel it was right, scrapped it. They always felt that, look, we don't want to do a video just for the sake of doing a video, it has to be right. And they got it right with One.
So what they did was they decided to buy some rights to footage from a film called Johnny Got His Gun, which is a wartime film about a soldier who loses his limbs and is forced to live this kind of terrifying existence, sort of cocooned within himself. And that indeed is the subject of One. Metallica didn't pursue an entirely predictable route. Now, the predictable route would have been to make it a standard performance video, and in many ways, the major part of the video is just that. They're in a warehouse, it's black and white, they're moshing, the camera is focused on the guitar strings and the picks and the actual sort of musical skills that they're demonstrating, which is a good thing.
Hold my breath as I whisper, dear. Oh, please, God, wake me.
It's like a piece of meat that keeps on living.
The video for One is just such a great example of that. Listen to the song. It just seems to go on in a very different way. There's no obvious punchline to the chorus, and when you actually see that imagery of that guy trying to type out Morse code with his head, that's ugly. That's not something that they've made out of a desire to sell records. They wanted to make a powerful statement. Metallica had climbed atop an incredibly powerful pulpit, and they wanted to shock people, and they did.
Darkness imprisoning me. All that I see, absolute horror. I cannot live, I cannot die. Trapped in myself, body my only cell.
But the impact of the film clips is such that it really strikes home. It makes you realize what the songs are all about. And it also makes you realize when you see Metallica playing live like that, how much power they have, how much control they have, and how much fury they have. It's a very angry video in its own right, as it should have been, because it's very much an anti-war video, but it's also a very artistically creative one. And it's one that showed Metallica were right to wait until they could do a video on their own terms, which worked on their own terms.
In October 1990, Metallica entered One-on-One Studio in North Hollywood to record their next album. The much-anticipated self-titled album was released in 1991 and entered the charts at number 1. The album sold 650,000 units in the States during its first week. The album was responsible for bringing Metallica to the attention of the mainstream and has been certified 16 times platinum in the United States.
For the Black Album, Metallica recruited Bob Rock, a producer who was well known for his work with the Cult and Motley Crue. Now, these are bands that are nothing like Metallica, but what Metallica did like about his work with those albums was that it was a full bass-heavy sound. which really was perfect for radio. It was perfect for the slower songs which Metallica were writing, songs which were aimed at the much larger venues they were beginning to play, and songs which were appropriate for the fact that after this many years playing thrash metal, they were slowing down, looking for a different direction. It took a long time to record the Black Album, the best part of 2 years, really. Partly because the band were going through some personal troubles with their own, there were divorces and so on going on in the background, but also because they were really, really fine-tuning the sound. It was a brand new sound for them, much more mainstream, much more in your face, much more bass-heavy, much more suitable for radio, and they really, really micromanaged every aspect of that sound, and as a result, it took a long, long time to put together.
But what they did was appeal to a wider cross-section. They actually got hold of pop fans who said, oh, actually, the songs are really good. They were more obvious. They were still heavy, still Metallica heavy, but they were more obvious melodies. And that's the difference. And they took a long time in making sure they got it exactly right. And you ended up with an album that's one of the great records of the 1990s and really took metal to another level. And it's the biggest selling metal album of all time.
So it's going to be a really obvious kind of choice for me in terms of my favorite Metallica video of all time. It's got to be Enter Sandman. You know, the moment that the 18-wheeler goes through the bed, every time I've heard that song, I visualize that thing where James Hetfield goes, boom! Everyone's seen that.
It was launched onto the public and it made an enormous impact because it's a very, very catchy sort of song. It's unforgettable, really. It's heavy, but it's melodic. It has a chorus you can sing along without sort of being completely commercial. And it has that video, which is very interesting. It's kind of a sort of a... They attempted to make a kind of an artistic nightmare into a video, which ties in with the themes of the songs, the kind of sort of primal fears and worries that people have, and the sort of the childhood stuff of the monster under the bed and the Sandman himself. And that video was perfect for MTV. It really helped to elevate Metallica from the thrash metal band with progressive touches that they had been before for a certain audience to a mainstream audience which perhaps had not been into metal too much before that.
Nothing Else Matters is an incredibly interesting song because it's a love song. You know, it's the very definition of what a ballad is. By the way, the definition of a ballad is a song where you can flick a cigarette lighter, and if you can sway it in time to the song without the flame going out, then that's a ballad. Metallica were capable of writing a love song. It displayed a sensitive side of James Hetfield, but it was still heavy as. It's an absolute totem of their live set. It has to come out because it's one of the greatest songs ever written.
Hetfield wrote the song while he was on the phone to his girlfriend while the band were on the road. And he had the phone in one hand, he was toying with his guitar, and he came out with a 4-chord sequence. And he didn't want this on the album. When he'd written the song, it was a song for him. It was something that he would do what he wanted with. But Lars heard it and said, "That's brilliant. We need that on the record." And obviously, it ended up on Black Album. It's become one of the band's best-known songs, still in the live set to this day. The video is quite funny. It's it's clips from A Year and a Half, which was a documentary that the band filmed of making the Black Album, and it's basically them just goofing around in the rehearsal studios.
So close, no matter how far. Couldn't be much more from the heart.
The bit that always makes me laugh is that there's a picture of Kit Winger, the hair metal rocker, up on one of the walls, and in one of the clips Lars is throwing darts at him, which I think is a needless point, but kind of a good explanation of why Lars, who Lars is and why he's Lars, I suppose.
Never cared for what they know, but I know.
And man, I got to say that James Hetfield's solo has got to be one of the best ever because it's sung, it's not played. Everyone knows that song note for note, whether they like it or not. And, if people don't like it, who cares? They secretly like it.
Not long after the release of the album, the band experienced another near tragedy when their pyrotechnics went awry during an ill-fated performance with Guns N' Roses at Montreal's Olympic Stadium.
The Metallica Guns N' Roses tour is one of the biggest tours of all time. I mean, getting those two giants together on the bill was huge and remarkable. Unfortunately, it was also a show with a lot of pyros, and more unfortunately, unless the members of the bands on stage stood in particular positions when the pyros were going off, they stood the chance of being burnt. And that's what happened.
James made the mistake of stepping on a spot which was reserved for a pyrotechnic explosion. When this went up, the whole front of his arm was burned and his hand. He was taken off. I remember Jason Newsted, the bass player, saying at the time that James's skin had been bubbling like something from a horror movie.
James Hetfield's incident with the pyro has got to be one of the most legendary accidents of all time. I mean, the terror you would have felt just like having this flamethrower jump out of the ground and, you know, just completely fry your arm. I mean, people talk about getting back on the horse. That guy had to get back up on stage eventually. How he did it, I don't know, but I love the attitude and how he came to grips with it all. He had a tattoo of flames put on the very part that actually got burned, and that felt like a bit of a middle finger. I love it.
And he spent a long time after that walking around with this horrendous protective device. And had he been standing a little bit closer to the explosion, he would have been dead.
I mean, James was always going through problems anyway. A few years previously, he'd broken his wrist when he was skateboarding around an arena and could only sing on stage for a little while because of the problem with his wrist. So that John Marshall, one of his roadies, who then joined Metal Church, had to get up on stage and play guitar for him. So yet again, problems. But then James just rises through the problems and comes out the other side.
The first question tonight comes from a fan. This one is from Robin Schilling in Stuttgart, Germany. Wants to know, when James, you hurt your back, you used different singers to fill in for him during a few concerts. Is that something that you would do again, maybe for an album?
Look forward to hurting my back once a tour, yes. No, it was the most ungood thing that happened. Seeing someone else sing my songs.
It's
I
all
wasn't
right, man.
there.
You're a mist, man. You're a mist.
No, it wasn't fun. I'm
How
glad,
was it playing
I'm
at the
glad everyone
Coliseum?
stepped up to the plate, though, and continued with the show. I was cool.
So by the mid-90s, heavy music had completely changed, right? You've got to remember there was this another year zero in heavy metal in the form of 1991 when Metallica had their Black Album, Nirvana released Nevermind, and the Chili Peppers released Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Now all these three heavy records really redefined what sort of guitar music was.
The 90s were a really weird time for heavy music, and just music in general. You know, the grunge wave had kind of wiped away a lot of the sort of poodle metal of the 1980s. You know, things were going off into weird progressive tangents. You know, Korn were around, and Metallica, this thrash band of yore that had suddenly sold tens of millions of records, they gone platinum. They didn't know how they fit in, and so they began to adapt to the environment around them.
Now, by 96, when Metallica were looking to release the follow-up album to the Black Album was so huge. I mean, it was like Appetite for Destruction, it was like Back in Black, it was like Hotel California, right? It was immense. So to follow that up with a record, what do you do? You know, do you do the same stuff over and over again? You certainly don't. So what they did was they looked at the musical environment, they looked at how they themselves had evolved as musicians, what their ambitions were. So what happened with Load, you had images of the band with short hair, they were wearing eyeliner, you had the video for Until It Sleeps. Both the song and the video were sort of artistically quite ambitious. The subject matter was serious. It was about the loss of James's mother and the illness which she had suffered. And to translate that into video form, they took a sort of rather abstract route. They basically were made up. They were playing imaginative roles. I'm not sure if it was entirely successful, I have to say that, because you look back at it now, it looks a little bit pretentious and in some ways a little bit of a waste of budget, right? But it very much exemplifies the direction that Metallica were going in at the time, and the direction they're still going in. You know, they're trying to push the boundaries and do something a little artistically different from what they've done before. That said, when you saw, I believe it's Kirk is covered in makeup and being sort of crucified, as it were, on a cross, you sort of think, yeah, I understand the direction you're trying to go in and the point you're trying to make. I wonder whether it's wholly in line with the image, you know, which Metallica had built for themselves over the previous decade and a half.
So hold me until it
staying out till the end of May, North America, and then we are going to finish part 2 of the Load album, which is probably about halfway done, and we just got to do the overdubs, and it should be out, knock on wood, by Thanksgiving.
They cut their hair, they changed their aesthetic, they began writing songs that kind of reflected the times. I mean, never did they seem further, never was the pendulum of Metallica's creative core further away from their roots than during that Load and Reload era. The truth is, they wrote some great songs, but it was strange for anyone that knew what they had done 10 years prior. They were in a very different place. But in fairness to them, metal was in a very different place as well. It had never been less cool to the popular media, and I think a lot of people were struggling to find relevance for themselves. A lot of artists were going through the same transitions. It's just that Metallica were under the brightest spotlight of all because they were the biggest band of the land.
Can you talk a little bit about how it feels to take this award, seeing as how long you guys have been making music and music is changing so much?
I think it's really cool that we're still considered relevant. I mean, it's been 15 years and there's been so many changes around us. I think within the band, it's still very, very strong. And it's just great. This is voted for by the fans, and you know, we got snubbed at the Grammys, and it's great that we're here and winning, and by the people that really matter.
So you pissed off about getting snubbed at the Grammys?
This is much more fun.
Yeah, this is not bad.
Loser.
Our music definitely is stood the test of time. 15 years is 15 years, and like you know, our early stuff sounds as fresh as it did back then. I mean, to me, it does.
In the year 2000, Metallica led a battle over the rights of recording artists against Napster, a popular music file-sharing website where fans could download music for free. Metallica not only responded with copyright infringement suits against Napster, but demanded that the estimated 335,000 Napster users who had ever downloaded a Metallica track be permanently barred from the service. To critics, it was a confounding strategy that inevitably targeted some of the band's most fanatical followers.
With respect to the whole Napster thing, are you okay with it being kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke here and there in situations like this?
We're the ones initiating most of it. Believe me, I mean, if you can't take the piss out of yourself, I mean, then you're a pretty sorry state.
I'll never forget seeing Metallica around the time of the Napster controversy, and I didn't really appreciate just how badly they had misunderstood the issues. And when I saw them at RFK Stadium, and when Metallica had come on, I had drunk a few beers. They were overpriced, really cheap, and I was already angry about the entire thing. So you can imagine my absolute rage when the actual set was interrupted by this public service announcement that was just so horribly misguided, so badly orchestrated. And I remember the sort of tsunami of profanity that rose up around me, because basically they put a big advert up on the Jumbotron that basically consisted of Lars Ulrich like running into a dorm room and stealing the guy's girlfriend and his Pepsi, and then turning to the camera and going, well, that's not cool. If you don't like being stolen from, then you shouldn't steal music. It was something just like, it felt like it made criminals out of us all. And it just wasn't fair. We'd all paid to be there. We owned all the records. There were Metallica fans everywhere. And it kind of cemented just how badly Metallica were alienated from the very fan base that had helped put them there. Because A, they didn't understand the debate. B, they were trying to treat their fans as criminals. And C, the fact is everyone looked at them and said, hang on, you guys have sold millions upon millions of records. Nobody disagrees on the stealing music thing. But nobody agrees that Metallica should have been the figureheads for the entire fight, because they are the ones that were living off the fat of the land. And it just wasn't right. It wasn't metal.
Around the time of the Napster controversy, Metallica made plans to enter the recording studio. However, in 2001, Jason Newsted left the band. He cited his tension with Hatfield as the main reason for his departure. Newsted went on to reveal his intentions to start a side project, a band called Echo Brian. James Hetfield was strongly against the idea, and that led to the two falling out.
James, why did you go ballistic when Jason did a solo project? You didn't do this version of Conformity single.
I can do what I want. He can't. No. I didn't do that thing. You're not supposed to know.
You're looking at 4 papoons right here.
Let me confirm that for you.
Tap boom.
That was definitely not a solo thing. That was just totally doing backups for some buddies.
Tensions had been building between Jason Newsted and the rest of the band. Jason's an ambitious guy, he's a great musician, and when he does something, he does it 100%. Now, he had given everything to Metallica. Tension built to the point where Jason left the band. And it's interesting because it coincides with a period of flux that started right after this. Hatfield went to rehab, they began their St. Anger sessions, all sorts of crazy stuff was going on in their lives. Not least because they were being trailed by a camera crew for the later release of the Some Kind of Monster film.
Jason Newsted is he's a bit of an enigma, you know? I mean, he has association with so many incredibly credible bands, but he'll always be known as the guy who replaced Cliff Burton, a guy who was completely irreplaceable, certainly. By the time Newsted had split, I think they were ready to go their separate ways. Jason must have had enough years of trying to live up to something that he could never quite live up to, not just in the band's eyes, but also in the fans' eyes as well. I don't think he ever got fair treatment from anyone, and I don't think his contribution to 90s Metallica was ever fully acknowledged until years and years later. You listen back to those songs, they wrote some absolute classics, but it's only in the retrospective gaze, time, 20 years later, that we listen to it and we're able to reassess what a lot of people didn't like at the time was actually a lot better than we gave it credit for.
In April 2001, a camera crew began following Metallica to document the recording process of the next album. Over 2 years, more than 1,000 hours of footage was recorded. During the filming of the documentary, James Hetfield entered rehab due to alcoholism and other addictions. All recording plans were put on hold and the band's future was in doubt. Hatfield left rehab on December 4th, 2001, and the band returned to the recording studio on April 12th, 2002, though Hatfield was required to limit his work to 4 hours a day, noon to 4 p.m., and spend the rest of the time with his family. The footage was eventually compiled into the documentary Some Kind of Monster, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2004.
When James was in rehab, it didn't look at any point as if the band would seriously split up and stop being an active unit. There was just too much at stake for that to happen. What it did do was influence the relationships within the band and influence slightly the direction that they took.
Some Kind of Monster is a fascinating documentary. You don't have to be even remotely interested in metal or indeed Metallica to find it. Just this weird kind of bit of car crash movie making, you know? I mean, because it was a portrait of a band in dissolution. You know, it wasn't just that they had problems, it's just that they didn't know who they were anymore. Much of the documentary is about James's problems with alcohol, his sort of need for counseling, and how a band grapples with huge success, being in the public eye, being under a magnifying glass, facing the expectations of tens of millions of people. That'll crack anyone. A lot of people like myself who kind of moved on from Metallica began to see them as human beings again, not as these rich rock stars, just as people,
During the filming of Some Kind of Monster, Metallica started to hold auditions for Jason Newsted's permanent replacement. Following 3 months of auditions, Robert Trujillo, formerly of Ozzy Osbourne's band, was chosen as the new bassist.
I mean, what ends up happening is you're touring with people you enjoy being around, and it's like the traveling circus in a way. I always think of touring like that in general, but it's always nice when you have the camaraderie as well. Not just the business side, but again, the friendship. In this day and age, it's very different than it was, say, 10 years ago even. You really need to get out there and perform your music. And in a way, it kind of separates the true kind of performance rock-oriented bands from maybe bands who are using a lot of the digital technology and the computers in creating their music with the machinery rather than the instruments. And so it's a great testing ground. It's a great way to prove yourself as a live group. And I think that's important. At the same time, when you're performing concerts and you're touring, these days you have to get out there and you got to get your merch out there, get your t-shirts going and all of that stuff. So that's very important. It's not so much about royalties anymore and how many CDs you sell. I think it's more about getting out there and playing and improving yourself. And you really got to earn what you're getting now. So it's very interesting, but I think it's good, you know. I think there's nothing more special than actually performing the music that you create, and especially for audiences like this. It's an awesome way to present what you have to offer as an artist to the world, to so many people that you wouldn't be able to get to, you know, in maybe a club setting. Club settings are great, but at the same time, this helps. Festivals like this, they help.
In June 2003, Metallica's 8th studio album, Saint Anger, was released and debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Saint Anger was a belligerent and sometimes tinny-sounding effort that put off some longtime Metallica fans.
The first thing, or maybe the first or second thing after a few expletives anyone will say about Saint Anger is something about the snare drum. The truth is, it wasn't just about the production on Saint Anger. It was also about Metallica being out of step with who they were. You know, they were trying to kind of come across as a band that didn't require the sort of the polish of the studio, an underground band. The fact is, no one was buying it. It was out of step with the times. It just didn't have the songs. It didn't have the production, but it didn't have the gusto either. Metallica had spent too much time trying to figure out who they were rather than just being who they were. Now that sounds like a psychologist's analysis. The thing is, having just watched Some Kind of Monster, I think everyone kind of had a view of their world, the indecision, the insecurity, and the fallibility, and all of a sudden, Saint Anger became a lot more easy to understand because it was obvious Metallica had lost touch with who they were.
There's a long history of, you know, albums being made in prisons, you know, Johnny Cash, for example. So in some ways, when Metallica decided to film Saint Anger at San Quentin, they were just following in a sort of long line of tradition. It's a little bit of an odd video, really. It's a performance video, essentially. Quite a lot is made of the safety aspect, you know, that if Metallica are going to get kidnapped, then there will be no negotiation with the prisoners and so on. So all of that is kind of amped up in a slightly macho way.
Welcome to San Quentin. We're all excited you're here, staff and inmates alike. One thing I do have to tell you before you enter, the state has a no hostage policy. In the unlikely event that you are taken hostage, the state will not negotiate your release in exchange for the release of an inmate. Agree with that?
The problem really is the song is not very strong. You know, it's kind of hard to listen to. There are points when the guitars are slightly out of tune and the vocals are slightly out of tune with the guitars. But it's interesting, you know, as these things go. It's an interesting experiment in a sort of different aesthetic.
In 2006, Metallica announced on its official website that after 15 years, longtime producer Bob Rock would not be producing Metallica's next studio album. The band chose to work with producer Rick Rubin. They entered the studio with Rubin and came out with Death Magnetic in 2008. The album was seen as a return to Metallica's thrash roots.
Death Magnetic is a return to form for Metallica, undeniably. No one's going to class it a classic. No one's going to say it was better than Master of Puppets or the Black Album, but it was moving in the right direction. The production sounded okay. It had some songs. It had some riffs. A lot of the songs were way too long, and to be honest, when people will say, could you play some Metallica on a radio show or on the jukebox, they probably don't pick a song off of that, but it does have some fantastic songs. It seems that Metallica of yore and Metallica of now had suddenly aligned themselves and become some semblance of what everyone wanted to hear, which was a metal band writing fantastic metal songs. Metallica version 2.0 had fully arrived.
We've been very fortunate, especially with Death Magnetic, our new CD. It's always sort of an interesting test when you put out something new, how your fan base is going to respond. And with Metallica, there's always been that kind of scenario where your fans are pissed off because you weren't heavy enough, or you shifted gears a little too hard here and you're too progressive, or you can't please everybody. But it seems like with Death Magnetic, There's a lot of happy people out there, and maybe that has to do with the fact that the band has sort of reconnected with some of the original thrashy roots and that element. For me, it's my first official recorded album with Metallica, so it's very special. It's also my first collaborative creative effort with this band, and again, very special for me. So the fans have really adapted well to the music, and in a lot of ways, I feel that the music on this CD is it's like a very cool painting. You know, I think it's very dynamic. It has something for everybody, and it feels like a launch pad into the future. You know, and then working with Rick Rubin, our producer, was very special for us too. So I foresee another brilliant CD and another batch of happy fans, and hopefully an expanded fan base.
The disappointment of the hugely unpopular album Saint Anger had been put behind them, and after touring the world with their latest album, Death Magnetic, Metallica transferred their musical skills to the big screen in 2013. They starred in their own 3D concert film titled Metallica Through the Never. The film shares its name with a classic song from the band's 1991 self-titled release.
We'd say it's a dramatic film set against the background of a concert, a set, a concert setting. But it has it's the story of a character whose name is Trip, who's played by Dane DeHaan, and it sort of follows his journey through a kind of a night where there's a particular sort of unfolding of unfortunate events that happen to him, and then it sort of it weaves itself in and out of this concert that kind of just continues in real time, and then you sort of see his journey, and you go back to the concert and you see his journey, and so it's kind of back and forth. It's quite unique. There's not really ever there's not, at least to my knowledge, any other films quite like it. And when I was sitting trying to explain this to Hollywood's finest directors about 2 years ago, they all looked at me like I came from Mars or something.
So the Through the Never movie, you have to look at it as not just another product that Metallica have made. It's a symptom of their frame of mind now, which is that they're trying to extend their brand in an interesting way. You know, they could keep doing these mega tours and rake in the cash. They could put out an album every 5 years. But they're trying to do other stuff.
You know, with us, we wanted to try to do something different with it. Everything for this movie was created for the movie. We built the stage for the movie. The concerts were just for the movie. You know, the audience were really extras. Do you know what I mean? So it's just a different thing. So we hope people will appreciate the effort that's gone into it.
I know for a fact that Metallica didn't make their money back on it because they talked about this candidly in interviews. They put several $1 million into it, which wasn't recouped. But that said, it's an interesting experiment by a band which is at liberty to do this kind of thing.
You know, we do like to take ourselves out of the comfort zone as much as possible, and I do believe that Metallica is a better band for all our forays into all of these other areas, because I think we come back to Metallica re-energized and reinvigorated.
Metallica are undoubtedly one of the most influential heavy metal bands of all time. For over 30 years, they've been selling out shows and selling millions of albums worldwide.
You know, who would have thought back in 1981, when Metallica first sort of started getting their stuff together, that this sort of gang of punks would make something so big and so enduring. They are the Led Zeppelin of our generation.
Metallica are undeniably just one of the greatest bands of all time. It's because they don't just represent the highs, but also the lows, the triumphs, the tragedies, the victories.
Their legacy will live on and influence future metal bands for generations to come.
And their influence and inspiration of so many generations now in metal is unquestioned and unquestionable. And they're always looking for ways to move forward as well.
One of the biggest misconceptions about heavy metal is that it's just loud, that it's savage and somehow primitive. The truth is, Some of the best musicians in the world are playing heavy metal music because it combines the savagery with a kind of grace and elegance and fluid musicianship that you see more commonly among classical musicians than you do in any other genre, because it's not really blues-based. It's actually based on a 4/4 time structure and a lot of really wheedly kind of bits and so on. That's not to say it doesn't have elegance. It's not just exhibitionism. But metal is a demanding thing, physically demanding, technically demanding, and to be creative and to do something different, you really have to know how to put a song together. Metal musicians are among the best in the world.
In metal terms, they are unquestionably the most successful there's ever been, and because of that, they are true giants of the genre.
Metallica truly are the master of metal.